What's up you guys, it's Bombholtz here, back at it again with another FC25 video. Today we are going to be ranking the midfielders as a tier list. With the newest edition of promos that we've gotten throughout the weeks of all the new players, and with FUT Birthday adding 5-star to all their players in this promo, this tier list for the midfielders is definitely be interesting. So with this video, I hope I can inform you guys with the newest meta for the midfielders on this tier list. So grab some popcorn because I'm going to go over at least 205 players on this tier list. Let's get into the video. Okay, so we have a lot of players on this tier list. I might miss a couple or even a bunch, who knows, but all these players are relevant in today's meta, so I figured why not just go with what I have. And if I miss anybody, just let me know what the player's name is in the comment section below, and I'll gladly tell you what tier position they go on this list. Okay, so the first player that we have Team of the Year FUT. Obviously, without a doubt, she goes into that S tier spot. She has the play styles, good animations, and she's very cracked in game. No surprise to me. And now she has a FUT Birthday card, that being 5-star. It's a little bit watered down to what her Team of the Year is, but she's also very good in game. She deserves that S tier spot. We also have that promo card for FUT. She is borderline A and B tier. I've also seen some pretty cool evolutions added to this card, but she'll stand right in that role. Okay, so now we have Grassroots McAllister. This card is very good in game. He gets that S tier spot. Now we have Swap Token McAllister. He sits borderline A and B tier. He's fallen out of the meta, but he's also a club legend for me, so he stands in this position. Now we have FUT Birthday Rabiot. He sits borderline A and S tier. FUT Birthday Patrick Vieira, without a doubt, he also sits in the S tier spot. This card being 5-star. Very good animations in game, very annoying to play against. He sits in that spot. And with his Thunderstruck, he sits borderline A and S tier, as he's also now has a better card. Next up, we have FUT Birthday Ramirez. Without a question, this card is S tier. His base card was pretty good to use in the beginning stages of the game. He hasn't got a promo card ever since until now. This card is a joke. He's 5-star, has very good playstyles, and he's overall a solid card. Now we have Team of the Year Rotary. No surprise, he sits S tier. We also have Centurion's Rotary. He sits borderline A and B tier. Now we have Team of the Year Jude Bellingham. Without a question, he sits in the S tier spot, and his FUT Birthday also sits in the S tier spot. Grassroots Shonolulu, this card is cracked in game. He sits in the A tier spot. However, I've seen a lot of people evolve him, including myself. This card would sit comfortably in the S tier spot, as this card is very good to use in game. Gundogan, this card's fallen out of the meta. He sits B tier. Grassroots Grob, he's a pretty solid card to use on a budget. He sits in the A tier spot, and his token sits in the B tier position. Team of the Year Pele, no question, S tier, and his base sits in the S tier if you play him at the Shadow Striker role. Playmaker, he does get the job done, but he'd sit borderline A and S tier, but Shadow Striker, definitely an S tier card. But Birthday Raskin sits borderline A and B tier. Winter Wildcard Bernardo Silva sits in the C tier spot. Jack Grealish at Cam, C tier spot. John Stones, this version would just to anticipate, he would sit borderline B and A tier. And then you had the Bruiser John Stones, who gets that anticipate plus Evo, would sit in the A and S tier role, because those two paired up at a CDM role is unbeatable in that position. Michael Laudrup sits in the C tier. Future Stars Lavia sits in the A tier spot. Nazareth sits borderline B and A tier. Until she gets her upgrade, she would get in that A tier spot. FUT Fantasy Nazareth would sit comfortably in the B tier spot for now. When she gets her upgrade, she would be a lot better. She would sit in that A tier spot. Fabio Carvalho sits in the borderline A and B tier. Flashback Mason Mount sits borderline B and C tier. Europa League Cherokee sits borderline B and C tier as well. Storyline Eze sits in the A tier spot. Winter Wildcard Vitinha sits in the A tier spot. This card is a club legend for some people. He's actually very solid to use in game. He's good defensively, and he has very unique animations. Future Stars Pavlovich, pretty solid card to use in game. He sits borderline A and S tier. Now this is where it gets interesting. We have icons that also play Cam, and I hope that you guys don't play me a ham at Cam, because I think that would be a waste. But if I were to rank where she goes at Cam on this tier list, her base Winter Wildcard would go borderline A and B tier. And that's because she has low passing, and I just don't think she's formatted enough to be a Cam. Now her prime would sit in the A tier spot. She has very good unique animations in game, but she's also not formatted to be a cam. But you know, if you're a player at a shadow striker role, she gets the job done. You could argue if Winter Wildcard me and him at 89, she could get the job done at shadow striker, but again, I think it would be a wasted player there, and the same thing would go with her base, borderline B and A tier. Tim Cahill, he would sit borderline C and D tier. Grassroots Conte, very good card to use in game. He sits in the S tier spot, and his Globetrotters would sit in the B tier position. FUT Fantasy Benacer would sit in the B tier spot. Whenever he gets those upgrades, he would sit in the A tier spot as well. Chukwemeka would sit in the B tier spot. Grassroots Elise at the cam role is very nice to use in game. He sits in the S tier spot, and his Thunderstruck would sit borderline A and B tier. I do know that a lot of people would have him as a club legend. He's also a club legend for my team, but with this stage of the game, he doesn't get that S tier spot. It doesn't sit comfortably in the A tier spot as well. Future Stars Johan Cruyff, shouldn't be surprised. He sits in that S tier spot as a cam, and his base would sit in the A tier spot. Now, a lot of people also have that on this day Cruyff. Just as is, his card would sit in the B tier spot. I've seen some Evos, he would also sit in the A tier spot, barely hanging on because of the low passing at the cam roll. Numero FUT Gilmore would sit in that B tier spot. Connor Gallagher's FUT Fantasy would sit borderline B and A tier. Now we have Grassroots Fukruk. He would sit in the B tier spot. He's pretty good to use on budget, but his shooting is too low. Now we have Winter Wildcard's Lookman. This card with the 99 dribbling, pretty solid to use because of that. This card sits in the B tier spot, and his honorable mentions would sit borderline B and A tier. Now we have one of my favorite cards to use in game. We have Flashback Rolfo. She's back. She gets that S tier spot comfortably. And her Winter Wildcards would sit borderline A and B tier. Team of the Year honorable mentions Pedri would sit in that A tier spot. Grassroots Dybala, very good card to use at the cam roll. He sits in the S tier spot. And with Dybala's Player of the Month, he would sit borderline A and B tier. Globetrotters Dembele would sit borderline B and A tier. Cavardona Centurions would sit borderline C and D tier. Team of the Year Cole Palmer, no surprises, sits in that S tier spot. Winter Wildcards Cole Palmer would sit borderline B and C tier. Thunderstruck Desai, he has a center defensive mid role. He's also a club legend for me. I tried him at that role and he's not good enough, so he sits in that D tier spot. Thunderstruck Raquelme, D tier spot as well. Philip Lahm, borderline C and D tier. Globetrotters Kaká would sit in the C tier spot. Grassroots Abedi Pele would sit in the A and B tier spot. Now we have Swap Token Axel Witsel. This card sits in the C tier spot as he's fallen out of the meta. I do prefer him to play him at center back. Now we have Trackstars Ginola. This card's pretty fun to use in game, but he's also fallen out of the meta. Hopefully he gets another special card soon throughout FUT Birthday. I doubt they would release him on Sunday, but for Team 2, I could definitely see him being that team. With that being said, he sits borderline A and B tier, and his base would sit in the B tier spot. Now we have FC Pro Insigne. This card sits borderline C and D tier because he's not good enough at the cam roll. He's too small and weak, and he's fallen out of the meta. He does have some decent stats, but there are a lot better cards to play at that role. Now we have FUT Birthday Ruben Neves. This card sits borderline A and B tier. Now we have FUT Birthday Ronaldinho, my favorite card for this promo. This card sits comfortably in the S tier spot, and his Globetrotters would sit borderline A and S tier due to there being more Ronaldinho cards, and his base would sit comfortably in the A tier spot. Now we have FUT Birthday Isco. This is a pretty solid card, being 5-star, 5-star. I could see him being more of an affordable cam to play, so he sits in that A tier spot. Now we have FUT Fantasy Caicedo. This card is surprisingly amazing for me in game. I put him in that S tier spot. I can't imagine how good he would be with other upgrades, but since he got that yellow card the other game, Chelsea, he let me down, but he sits in that S tier spot, and I bet Chelsea would get the goals that they could get so he could get maximum upgrades for his playstyles and stats. Numero FUT James Rodriguez would sit in the B tier spot. And Numero FUT Goretzka, I own this card. I don't think he's very good to use in game at a holding center mid role, but as a box-to-box, he's pretty solid. I like him at the A and B tier spot. Globetrotters Martin Odegaard to sit in the D tier spot. And Martin Odegaard's Champions League card is very good in game. He sits borderline A and S tier. Thunderstruck Barella's fallen out of the meta. He sits in the B tier spot. Future Stars Dumernay sits in the C tier spot, as she's not very good to use at center mid. She's much better to use at striker. FC Pro Palacios sits borderline B and C tier. Swap Token and Kunku would sit in that B tier position. Medina as a cam would sit in the D tier spot because she has horrible passing. Winter Wildcards Declan Rice would sit borderline B and A tier. FUT Birthday Orbadorf would sit in the B tier position as well. Swap Token Tella would sit borderline A and B tier because at cam he's pretty good to use in game. Now we have Winter Wildcards Puel. I'm not a fan of this card to use at CDM. He sits in the C tier spot. Now we have FUT Fantasy Seigenkopf. This card sits borderline C and B tier. Swap Token Little would sit in the C tier spot as well. Now we have FC Pro Gravenberch. This card's pretty good to use in game. He sits in the A tier spot. Now we have Thunderstruck Zico. This card is amazing to use in game. That 5-star combo and very good playstyles to have at cam. He sits in the S tier spot, and Zico's base would sit in the A tier position. Storyline Bruno Guimaraes would sit in the borderline A and B tier. I'm not a fan of this card due to the combo with the 4-star, 3-star, but he gets the job done. I just wouldn't want to play him because I have Patrick Vieira in the midfield and I prefer to have him there. Now we have Future Stars Fowler at cam. I'm not a fan of her due to her low passing. She sits borderline B and C tier. Now we have Winter Wildcards Vincent Kompany. This card at holding center defensive mid, I'm not a fan of because of the low passing and the low dribbling. He's only good defensively, doesn't have much to offer in the midfield. This card sits borderline C and D tier. Now we have FUT Birthday Petit. This card is amazing. He sits borderline A and S tier. Now we have Team of the Year Lauren James. She doesn't have the roles to play as a cam, just as a wide playmaker, and I'm not a fan of that as a cam, so she sits in the A tier spot, and her total rush card would sit in the C and D tier spot. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Gurma. Again, she doesn't have much to offer in the midfield, so she sits in the D tier spot. Carlos Tevez as a cam, not a fan, but as a shadow striker, he's pretty good to use, but he sits in that C tier spot. Grassroots Roy Keane sits in the B tier spot, and his other cards I don't have on this list because they're outdated, but this is the only King card that I'm going to put on in this video. Now we have Thunderstruck Zidane. Now there's 4 different Zidanes. We have the 96, 94, the free 94 that we got, and the 90 Zidane. Now his Thunderstruck comfortably sits in the S tier spot, and I would say that his 94 would sit comfortably in the A and S tier spot, and his base would sit in the A tier spot, and this Zidane, the 90 Ray, would sit borderline B and A tier. Now we have Future Stars Frank Lampard. This card sits borderline B and A tier as well. Now we have Winter Wildcards Yaya Toure. This card would sit in the A tier spot. He still has it in game, very good animations, tough to get off the ball, has good pace and good shooting. Overall, pretty good card. Hopefully he gets more cards in the future. Now we have Future Stars Xabi Alonso. This card on a budget, pretty solid card. Still sits in the A tier spot. Now we have FUT Fantasy Billing. This card would sit borderline A and B tier. He needs a couple more upgrades to get in that A tier spot, and who knows, he could potentially become S tier if he gets that 99 boosted stat on his card. FUT Fantasy Buendia would sit borderline B and A tier. Now we have Road to the Final Zabasloy. This card at cam, very good to use in game. I like the card. This card sits comfortably between A and S tier. If he gets more upgrades, he could sit in that S tier spot. Now we have Player of the Month Patrick Iharo. This card sits in the C tier spot. Now we have Numero FUT Rude. This card isn't as good. She sits borderline C and D tier. Now we also have Road to the Final Dani Olmo. This card's pretty good to use in game. He sits in the A tier spot and could potentially become S tier after a couple more upgrades. I do believe that this card could potentially be on the same level as Sabasloy with how it's formatted, but few may argue he sits where he is. Now we have a bunch of Ritz. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have 4 Ritz cards. So I'm gonna go over what's the best spot to put each of the cards in. Now his center mid as a box to box, I would say he's borderline A and B tier. His total rush falling in the C tier, and his Player of the Month sits in the B tier spot, and his Winter Wild card that's just a cam also sits in the B tier spot because they're formatted roughly the same. Now we have Future Stars Rogers. This card sits comfortably in the A tier spot. He also has another card because it was a pick, but I prefer this one because I like Playmaker Plus on the card, and he also plays as a wing. We could get to that in another tier list video, but as a cam, as a Playmaker Plus, or even his other card, sits in the A tier spot. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Marta, With her being, if not arguably, the greatest female soccer player ever, she's old, and this is the card that she's got. I believe this card is borderline B and C tier due to it having low pace, but she has good dribbling, but the agility side is low on this card, and that's why she sits in the B tier spot. Also forgot to include Centurion's Bomati. This card's also falling out of the meta. She sits borderline B and A tier. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Musiala. This card sits borderline B and A tier. Future Stars Yildiz sits in the B tier spot. Now we have Sawa. I would say her box to box still holds up very good in game. She sits in the S tier spot, and her cam one sits in the A tier spot, and her base would sit in the B tier spot. Sawa's pretty good to use in game, but I prefer to have her at the box-to-box role if we're talking about the best Sawa. Centurion's David Beckham would sit in the C tier spot. Future Stars Luis Figo, pretty disappointing this year. He isn't preferred in a lot of people's lineups. This card would sit C tier. Now we have Future Stars Andrea Pirlo, very good value SBC. This card sits in the A tier spot. Winter Wildcard Xavi would sit borderline A and B tier. Now this is where it gets interesting. We have Winter Wildcards Neymar. Now he has a cam and striker one. However, both of the cards have cam at their roles. So I would say the cam formatted Neymar is in the S tier spot, and the striker Neymar playing at cam would sit in the borderline A and S tier spot. Okay, so now we have flashback De Bruyne. Shouldn't surprise much. He sits in the S tier spot. His Thunderstruck would sit in the A tier spot. He holds up pretty solid in game, but as a cam, that's where I prefer to play him. If I were to play this card, I wouldn't want to start him as a box to box because of the low defending, and his total rush would sit in the C tier spot. Now we have Grassroots Foudy. She sits in the A tier spot, and her Centurions would sit borderline C tier and B tier. Now we have Future Stars George Best. At a cam with that incisive pass on his playstyle plus, very good card with his dribbling formatted. I put this card in the A tier spot. Now we have Team of the Year Alexia Putellas. Shouldn't surprise all of y'all. She gets that S tier spot. Her Player of the Month in total rush would sit borderline B and C tier. Now we have FUT Birthday Kai Havertz. This card as a box-to-box holding center mid, borderline A and S tier. And his Champions League card would sit in the B tier and C tier position. Globetrotters Del Piero would sit in the C tier spot. Now we have Numero FUT Kamavinga. His animations are crazy in game. His very good play styles. He sits in the S tier spot. I was also lucky enough to pack Yao Neves in my 94 upgrade pack that you get at the end of the season. Play this card in game. He's very cracked. He sits in that S tier spot as well. FUT Fantasy Joe Cole. This card's pretty overrated to use. Not a fan of it, how it's formatted. This card sits borderline B and A tier. Okay, so now we have Winter Wildcards Gigi Buffon at center mid. You know, I prefer to have him in goal, so he sits in the C tier spot as a center mid. Okay, so now we have FC Pro Schweinsteiger when Anders won that entire tournament. He sits borderline A and S tier. Now we have Team of the Year Ronald Koeman as a center defensive mid. I tried him in game. I'm not a fan of him, but he still gets the job done defensively. I don't like him going forward, so he sits borderline B and A tier. Now we have Grassroots Hamsick. This card sits in the A tier spot. Now we have Team of the Year Wrighton. She doesn't have the roles that you'd want as a cam, but she still gets the job done in game because she's a Team of the Year card. She sits in the A tier spot. And her Thunderstruck, same thing, but she's not a Team of the Year card. She sits in the C tier position. Now we have Winter Wildcards Frankie de Jong. Both these cards hold up really well at this stage of the game, and they all go into the S tier spot. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Valverde. This card shouldn't be a surprise to you guys. He sits in that S tier spot as he's very cracked to use in game, and his Thunderstruck would sit in the A tier spot. Now we have FUT Fantasy Guti. This card sits in the A tier spot. Whenever he gets more upgrades, he could potentially be borderline A and S tier. Now we have more Jude Bellingham cards that I found throughout this pile that I created. This card would go borderline A and B tier, and his Team of the Week would go B tier. Now we have Thunderstruck Wayne Rooney. He isn't formatted enough to be a cam, but he still gets the job done in game. He is a borderline B and A tier because he has the Shadow Striker plus role and Playmaker plus role. Now we have Future Stars Caicedo. She's pretty solid in game. She sits comfortably B and A tier. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Lindsay Horan. She sits in that B and A tier spot. Now we have Winter Wildcards Rivaldo. This card's pretty unique in game due to the 99 physicality, and because of that, he sits borderline A and B tier at the cam roll. I prefer to play him out wide. Litmanen would sit borderline B and A tier. Now that we've gone throughout the stack a lot, I found Europa League Dybala. This card would sit in the A tier spot. Now we have Winter Wildcard Carlos Alberto as a holding center defensive mid. This card is a nightmare to go up against because defensively, he has crazy animations. He sits borderline A and S tier. There's a reason why he still goes over for $1 million today. Now we have storyline Roberto Firmino. Now, if I were to be honest with you guys, I haven't picked this card because we all went with that icon pick. But, I would say this card would sit in the A tier spot. I don't know how he is in game. He could potentially be S tier because he's formatted nicely as a cam, but this is where I would put him. Now we have Team of the Year Miyama. I'm a Miyama owner myself. I don't like her at center mid, so I'd put her at the B tier spot. Team of the Year Abili. She sits borderline A and S tier at that center mid role. Dennis Bergkamp, not a fan of him at cam. He's pretty cheap. There's a reason why he's so cheap. He sits borderline B and C tier. Thunderstruck Lothar Matthäus. This shouldn't surprise you guys. He gets that S tier spot as he's still very automatic to use in game. FC Pro Xavi Simons shouldn't be a surprise to you guys. Some people would argue with him being the S tier role. I've heard mixed reviews about him, so I'm gonna put borderline A and S tier. Champions League Julian Alvarez. I prefer to play him at striker, but at cam he doesn't get the job done as I would like. Press proven playstyle plus is nice to have on the card, but at cam I'm not a fan of him, so I'd put him at borderline B and C tier. Now we have FUT Fantasy Franciscoli. This card is pretty nice to use in game, but I don't think he deserves that S tier or A tier spot. I do believe he is more of a B and A tier player because over the years I'm not a fan of how this card performed in game. He does need a couple upgrades for him to be in the A tier spot. Now we have Grassroots Bruno Fernandes. This card sits borderline A and S tier. Now we have FUT Fantasy Dunn. This card sits in the A tier spot. Now we have Farrah Williams. Her card sits in the A tier spot. She's very underrated this year because she's a newer card, but she has anticipate. Don't sleep on this card because it could still get upgraded. Now we have numero foot Rafael Leao. This shouldn't surprise you guys. His card holds up really well at this stage of the game. He sits in that S tier spot, and believe it or not, I have his Evo, and I would say that his Evo is better than this card. So just imagine how much better this card is compared to all the other ones that are on this list. Now we have FUT Fantasy Walsh. I'm not a fan of this card, but she sits borderline B and A tier. Future Stars Ahmed Diallo sits comfortably in the A tier spot. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Messi. This card sits in the S tier spot as this card's pretty cracked and fun to use in game. Doesn't surprise me because Messi's always been good throughout the years. And Messi's Globetrotters would sit in the A tier spot. Now we have flashback Joshua Kimmich. This card borderline A and S tier as he holds up pretty well at this stage of this game. Now we have FUT Fantasy Marmouche. This card shouldn't surprise you guys. This card's gonna get upgraded and he's gonna be pretty good to use in game. Even with the card as is, this card's very solid, gets that S tier spot. Also found another Jude Bellingham card. His Champions League card sits borderline A and S tier. Now we have Thunderstruck Hullet. This shouldn't surprise you guys. This card gets an easy S tier spot. At Shadow Striker, this card is annoying to play against in the Elite Division because everyone does that over the top through ball, and this card with the controlled lengthy accelerant type outruns my entire back line, wins the aerials, and gets that aggressive goal. Now we have Team of the Year honorable mentions Phil Foden. This shouldn't surprise you guys. He gets that easy S tier spot. One of the most responsive dribbling players in the game, and his Thunderstruck is no different. He gets that A and borderline S tier spot because both these cards are just that good to use in game. Now we have FUT Fantasy Tucheme. This shouldn't surprise you guys. Easy S tier spot because he's getting upgraded. He's very automatic and annoying to play against in game. Has a bunch of play styles, and he's like another Patrick Vieira. Now we have Future Stars Bobby Charlton. At Shadow Striker, very tough to go up against in game to shut down defensively. This card gets a lot of goals for some people I go up against. Easy S tier spot. And Bobby Charlton's base still holds up at this stage of the game. He gets an A tier spot. Now we have FUT Fantasy Zé Roberto. Shouldn't surprise you guys. He gets an easy S tier spot as he's going to get upgraded, and he's a very automatic player to go up against, and he's also a fun card. Now we got one of the best value and fun SBCs to do during Christmas time. Zé Roberto's Winter Wildcards falling out of the meta, unfortunately, at this stage of the game. Hopefully he could get an Evo in the future to be usable again, but he sits in the B tier spot. Now we have FUT Fantasy Matuidi. PSG have been scoring a lot of goals lately, and they also got an upset against Liverpool. This card's to get upgraded because in the league, PSG are doing phenomenal. So this card, easy S tier spot. Now with Team of the Year, Irene Paredes. With her being at CDM, she was pretty solid, but I don't think she's better than all the other midfielders that we got in the game. So she sits borderline B and C tier. Now we have Grassroots Diego Armando Maradona. With that 5-star, 5-star combo at center attack and mid, this card will change your team. Easy S tier spot. Maradona's Grassroots card, Evolution. That card's fallen out of the meta. I do believe that he got shadow nerfed, so I'd put him at borderline A and S tier. And Maradona's base would sit in the A tier spot because of the 5-star, 3-star combo. Grassroots Baggio, very solid card, fun card to use. Love how it's formatted. This card's an easy S tier spot. And Baggio's Globetrotters would sit in the B tier position. Team of the Year Reinhardt, same thing, but she also has controlled lengthy as an accelerant type. She is better at CDM than Irene Paredes, so she sits borderline B and A tier as a holding center defensive mid. Now we have Mbappe's brother. This card sit borderline B and A tier. Now we have FUT Birthday Essien. This card's pretty fun to use, being 5-star, 5-star in game. He would sit borderline A and S tier. Now we have FUT Birthday Marquisio. Now with how good his card is throughout the years, he's been very solid whenever he gets a new promo card. This card gets an easy S tier. FUT Birthday JJ Akacha, with it being 5-star, 5-star, being able to play at cam and out wide, this card's an easy S tier spot. I do wish they could boost his shooting a little bit more, but with that Hunter chemistry style, you can't go wrong. He'll still get the job done. And there you guys have it. That is my tier list of all 207 players that we currently have that are still relevant that you guys would see against your opponents. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below. And also, don't forget to tell me what players I forgot and what you guys would want to know where they go in this tier list. That'll be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. What'd you guys think of this tier list? Let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to leave a like on today's video and subscribe to my channel for more FC25 content. Also, click the link in the description and follow me on X. Be sure to tell your friends to subscribe to my channel to help it grow. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.